Hello, and welcome to the second part of a three-part series on human subject research and revisions to the Common Rule. My name is Snehal Trivedi, and I am an associate with K&L Gates, focusing my practice on FDA regulatory law. As Gina Bertolini mentioned in part one of the series, protection of human subject research has received increased legislative attention, and due to the expansive depth of this topic, we will only be covering a few significant areas. This part will provide a high-level overview on the changes related to informed consent and single IRB requirements. For purposes of the final rule, the Department of Human and Health Services, or DHHS, and the Common Rule agencies revisited the primary purpose of an informed consent, finalizing the requirement that such forms focus on readily informing patients of the information that investigators hope to obtain from subjects participating in the research. In addition to the existing elements required for an informed consent, the Common Rule now requires the forms to contain and begin with a concise and focused presentation of key information that is most likely to assist the subject in understanding the reasons why he or she may want to participate in the trial. Moreover, an informed consent under the new Common Rule must also provide that the subject's information may be used for commercial profit and that clinically relevant research results would be disclosed to the subject. Finally, the final rule adds a requirement to also include one of two applicable statements. One, that a statement that information may be used for future research studies or distributed to another investigator for future research without additional informed consent, or two, a statement that the subject's information will not be used for future research. Finally, the most significant addition to the informed consent requirements involves the inclusion of a broad consent provision. Under the existing rule, investigators may use biospecimens collected through a proposed study for a future unrelated study provided the identity of the subject was removed. The broad consent provision of the final rule now requires investigators and institutions to include a general description of the types of research that may be conducted in the future. Such general description must be sufficient enough to enable a reasonable person to anticipate the applicability of their consent towards types of research. Apart from the significant additions to the elements of an informed consent form, the final rule also exempts certain categories of research. In relevant part, the rule does not apply to research that involves the collection or study of existing data that is publicly available. Therefore, the exemption involves data or information that has already been de-identified at the initial time of collection. Accordingly, if a study falls into this category, none of the regulatory requirements, including obtaining informed consent, apply. Currently, the Common Rule also does not specify who may determine whether a research is exempt. Historically, the Office of Human Research Protections, or OHRP, has recommended that investigators not be given the authority to make an independent determination that their research is exempt. The final rule retains OHRP's current recommendation that institutions should implement exemption policies addressing who is responsible for making such determinations. Moving on to single IRB requirements, the final rule maintains the proposal that requires a single IRB to approve research taking place at multiple sites. The National Institutes of Health, or NIH, implemented a similar requirement last year. The single IRB requirement applies to all federally supported research, but the language of the final rule seems to allow agencies or departments to exclude certain broad types of research from the requirement. It's not apparent whether or how Common Rule agencies will actually exercise this discretion in applying the single IRB requirement, and therefore it remains a source of concern for hospital institutions. Most provisions of the final rule are scheduled to go into effect on January 19, 2018, except for the single IRB requirement, which is expected to take effect on January 20, 2020, barring, of course, any delays in implementation. Thank you for listening to this webinar, and be on the lookout for the third and last part of this series related to human subject research and revisions to the